Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Longform, the podcast produced by Jadaliyya. Our inspiration for these discussions is the well known quote by Antonio Gramsci: "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." I'm Bassam Haddad, and together with my co host Mouin Rabbani, we are exploring this theme with a series of guests whose work has provided valuable insights into these issues. For this episode, we're extremely delighted to be speaking with Hala Rharrit, a friend and a former colleague at Georgetown University, and in her own way, a warrior that you will hear a lot from today. I will first welcome Hala and extend a very actually warm welcome to Long Conversations to you, Hala. We're very much looking forward to speaking with you and traversing the world as we go through this conversation. أهلا وسهلا Hala, كيفك?
Ahlan wa sahlan. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
I would like to say a couple words about Hala because of the background that's going to be very important and pertinent to our conversation. Sometimes we don't actually read out the bio, so this is no exceptional treatment. It's just a contextual treatment. Hala Rharrit is an expert in Middle East and North African affairs and U.S. relations with the MENA region. She is a political commentator and an author, frequently appearing on international media. Hala was an award-winning American diplomat who resigned from the State Department in April 2024 in opposition to the Biden's administration Gaza policy. Hala is fundamentally a peacemaker, and her resignation made her the first career American diplomat to publicly resign. She has been one of the most vocal officials critical of the U.S. policy in Gaza, and in her many interviews since leaving the State Department, including with 60 Minutes, quite notably, because that interview actually, this is me adding to the bio, went far and wide and was quite revealing and insightful. We will also talk about that today. Other networks Hala appeared on include CNN, Washington Post, publication, NPR, Democracy Now!, and Al Jazeera English, among others. She explains there how the policy is illegal, inhumane, counterproductive, and a threat to U.S. national security on top of everything else. Hala joined the Foreign Service in 2006 as a political officer and has done quite a bit of work in Sana'a, Yemen, including being the political and human rights officer at the U.S. Embassy in Sana'a, and far beyond, actually. Her resume is quite long. We will be adding it to the post on Jadaliyya. So we will stop here, and I will ask Hala to address our recurring question to everyone, which is whether we are experiencing a transformation or a disintegration of the international order, or is this order experiencing yet one more challenge from which it will recover and perhaps emerge stronger than before, and we go back to business as usual. This is the theme of the conversation, so I'll put that to you, Hala, right up front. I know it's a lot to chew, but it's how we start our conversations.
Well, thank you again for having me. No, it's a very appropriate question for our times. And I'll just say, from my perspective, it's still being written. The answer is still being written. And I want to get that point to your audiences, because especially after over a year and a half of a genocide, it's so easy for all of us to get absolutely hopeless and desperate and feel like no matter what we do, we can't make an impact. But I want to stress that that is not the case. We the people, are the ones who determine the answer to that question. And I say this as someone who worked inside the government for 18 years, as someone who, for lack of better word, was part of the US government's propaganda arm. My last assignment that I resigned from was as spokesperson. And the US government, but not just the US government, all governments spend millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to convince citizens of things one way or another. And the only reason why they do that is because in reality, we're the ones who have the power. But governments take actions like arrests, like intimidation, like stops at JFK Airport for activists to try to instill a fear, to try to instill a silencing, to make sure that we, the people, bow down. So I'll say, first off, what do we want it to be? What do we, as citizens of the United States, as citizens of the world, want the answer to be to that question? I think it is clear that we cannot accept Israel's impunity. So far, it's gotten away with so much, but this story is not finished yet. We'll discuss my assignments later, but I served in South Africa, and for me, that tour was extremely enlightening, right? The story of Palestine is still being written, and we, all of us, are the ones who are writing it. Obviously, the Palestinians themselves are the ones writing it. But we have to ensure that our voices don't get weakened, that we don't get tired, that we don't get despondent, that we continue the struggle to ensure justice, to ensure that no country, including Israel, enjoys impunity, and that we create a new world order. The governments may have the money, and they have a lot of it through various means, but we have the numbers, right? And I think this has been what has been so difficult, is to get mass movement and mass mobilization to affect change. But we've seen through the arrests of the Palestinian students at Columbia how much of a threat peacemakers are, right? Because they do make an impact. There is a sea change. And we see with especially the youth in America, but also the youth in Europe, that there has already been a shift. And it's gone beyond even just Palestine. It's a rejection of colonialism, a rejection of exploitation, a rejection of a rules-based order that only works on behalf of Western countries, yet does not apply the same rules to the West. So I'm hoping, obviously, that this is the birth of a better world order, a birth of we will learn from this catastrophic, horrific time in history and ensure that justice is not just justice for the few, but justice for all. But in order for that to happen, it really does need to be mass mobilization. So I'm hoping that no matter where you're sitting, no matter what your role is, that you use your voice, because every voice truly does matter.
Hala, you joined the U.S. government in 2006, if I'm not mistaken. So several years after the invasion of Iraq. But that notwithstanding, what I'd like to ask you is, you're not the only one who seems to be describing the Gaza genocide as an inflection point, as a potential turning point. And the question is, what is so different about it when you compare it to other seismic events? For example, the invasion of Iraq, or for that matter, any of the other profound developments since 1945, wars, genocides, what have you. Is there anything specifically about Gaza that makes it an inflection point, a potential turning point, when compared to these other events that preceded it? Is there something unique about Gaza in this respect?
Yeah, I think there are a few things, but I'll focus on one. And my job was directly related to this. But I really think that the power of social media has been transformative for this particular conflict, because there's no denying the injustice. There's no denying the atrocities. There's no denying what is happening in Gaza unless you choose to willfully be blind to it, right? And the fact that everyone has had access to what is happening, to the atrocities, it's been live streamed on everybody's phone, I think has had a traumatic effect on so many around the world that we will not be able to reckon with for a very, very long time. I think it's opened up people's eyes in ways that, for example, the Iraq War, there were horrific atrocities that happened, yet people weren't consuming that information on a daily basis. Whereas in
I think we
Gaza,
had to wait a year or two till we started seeing the images coming from Abu Ghraib, for example.
yeah, and even Abu Ghraib, the government was very easily dismissed it as a one-off, right? It's
Mhm.
very different when you're seeing every single day images of children bombarded, of children being pulled out of the rubble. So I think Americans, a lot of Americans that, for example, never even knew where Palestine was or didn't care at all about the issue, weren't impacted, all of a sudden started saying what is happening. And I think in particular the youth that are more, on TikTok or on Insta, whatever it may be, they're more connected to social media. One, I think there's a generational shift, right? Because they didn't get all of the propaganda post 9/11 of sort of the Islamophobia, war on terror that was fed to the older generation of Americans. So the dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims wasn't as embedded in their minds. So when they're seeing children in Gaza getting killed, they see them as human beings. They don't see them as an other that they're able to just put away, put aside, and continue on with their daily life. So I think social media has had an intense impact on lifting the veil of what is happening, of what our tax dollars are doing. And then I think that that has led to a lot of questions. Well, if our tax dollars are doing this there, what else have they been doing? What are we doing in the Congo? What are we doing? What is happening around the world? What are we doing in Haiti? I think, again, it hasn't achieved a mass mobilization across the entire United States, but I can definitely say that it's been a sea change in the US when I'm speaking to, for example, veterans, right, that went from being in the US military families their whole lives, that are now completely have turned to becoming peace activists. If you had asked me that 10 years ago, that demographic just didn't exist, or it existed in a very, very small minority. And now that has really, really grown in numbers. So I think the traumatic effect of seeing everything that's been happening in Gaza has had immense impact that we can't really underestimate.
Thank you, Hala. We have a lot to talk about, actually, and it doesn't basically. It's not restricted to Gaza. So there's a sort of a trajectory I would like to address. But first, can you, before we get into the specific discussions, can you share with us a little bit about your experience at the State Department, especially prior to your resignation? And maybe feel free to address your experience there in general, but certainly the circumstances surrounding the context of your resignation, and anything that we should have as background to how this took place, and how it went when you actually did resign. A lot of people understand that people have resigned, and you were among, if not the first, you were actually the first. But there's not much information as to like the mechanics of this, and how is it treated internally, and so on. So if you can shed some light on this for us, please.
Sure. All right. There's a lot to cover there. So I'll start with I'll try to do a very quick summary of my career in the Foreign Service. So I joined in 2006. So I was a diplomat for 18 years, really practically my entire adult life after graduate school. And the reason why I joined the State Department was fundamentally I wanted to believe that if you want to see change, you need to create the change, right? And so I joined as a political officer, and my first assignment was in Sana'a. I chose one of the
In Yemen.
toughest, yes, exactly, in Yemen. I chose one of the toughest assignments right out of the bat because I felt like I wanted to try to make the most impact. I worked on political affairs and human rights there, and I felt like I was able to have very, very impactful work. There were actually three terrorist attacks while I was in Sana'a. A mortar attack where I was at the embassy, a mortar attack at our housing compound. I was not there, and we got evacuated, and I went back, and a massive suicide attack against the embassy when I was inside, where multiple people died, and we got evacuated again after that. And I'm sharing that only to give audiences a context of every assignment that I've had has taught me so much about society, about human interactions, about justice and injustice, and what drives human beings, and what is needed to reconcile differences. And Yemen was such a critical start to that journey. Then I went all around the world: Hong Kong, South Africa, Dubai, Qatar. And then my last assignment, and I focused mostly on political affairs, economic affairs, human rights, counterterrorism. And then my last assignment was the first public-facing one, where I was spokesperson at the US consulate in Dubai. We have a regional media hub there. So the regional media hub covers the entire MENA region, the entire pan-Arab media market. So I was a US government spokesperson. And it was fascinating. It was fascinating because I saw how talking points are generated, how they're created, why they're written a certain way. And then obviously sharing those talking points with the Arab media market. So before October 7th, I did 100 interviews or more on a range of topics, everything from China to Russia to the earthquake in Syria and Turkey. I was a spokesperson. But then on October 7th, obviously, as foreign language spokespeople, the ones that are not in Washington, we always wait for Washington to take the lead, and then we amplify. But then as soon as I saw the talking points, after October 7th, I said, I'm not saying this on TV. This is a lie. Or I would ask for reasons why things were written a certain way. Like, we stand with the Israeli people. I would say, where's the sentence, we also stand with the Palestinian people? You can't expect me to go on Arab media and talk only about one people and not the other. We're supposed to have neutrality when it comes to citizens, when it comes to innocent people. Or, for example, Hamas uses civilians as human shields. Show me the proof. Where is the proof? I have a top secret security clearance. I'm authorized to have that information. If that's the case, then I need to see it before I'm expected to say those things on TV. So on and so forth. Very, very long story short, I refused to do any interviews. I did not do a single interview on Gaza or on post-October 7th, basically. I refused. And instead, I was generating daily reports, basically covering what pan-Arab media was showing in terms of what was happening in Gaza, and how pan-Arab media was showing US involvement, or how we looked to the Arab world. And so, as you can imagine, my reports were very, very damning, saying that we look horrible. I didn't sugarcoat whatsoever. I said we're having a generational impact on US favorability. We are hated across the board by everyone, liberals, conservatives, it doesn't matter, because we're seen as child killers. So I would continuously do these warnings back to Washington. I would also put in those daily reports the facts about what were happening, and I would include images of the children that were dismembered, of the families that were stuck under the rubble. They were very graphic pictures, because I was basically showing Washington what the Arab world was consuming. And my warning every single day was, we are on the wrong side of history. We are violating US and international law, and everybody knows we're doing that. We are threatening US national security because we're putting a target on our back. I was often told, your reports are really important. They're going to the NSC, the National Security Council at the White House. I was told your reports are going to the 7th floor, which is where the secretary sits. At that time, it was Secretary Blinken. we need more of them. And so I would, as you can imagine, I would just put my heart and soul and literally sweat into those daily reports, thinking if Washington only knew, if only they understood, surely there's no way we could continue down this path. Obviously, we did. And little by little, I started feeling censored. I started feeling, I started getting excluded from certain meetings, no longer being CC'd on certain email communications. We were in charge of all U.S. officials that would do media in the Arab world. I would have to brief those people usually. I was no longer briefing them. Little by little, I started getting sidelined, silenced. And then eventually in January, I was told, your reports are no longer needed, which was a huge change from the beginning where they couldn't get enough of the reports. And then I was basically told in January, quote, the devastation in Gaza is understood. So at that point, obviously I'm leaving out a lot of details, but at that point, it became abundantly clear to me that no matter what I did, no matter what any diplomat did, and I'm talking about, after 18 years, and the State Department is not that big, I'm talking about ambassadors, very senior officials. I was having conversations with them, but no matter what any of us career diplomats did, the policy was the policy. It was made directly at the White House by 3 or 4 men. That's it, at the very top. And no matter the illegality, no matter what, it was not shifting. So I had a decision to make. I could stay and try to keep fighting from the inside. I was offered different jobs. I was asked, please don't go. We'll give you this assignment or that assignment. You don't have to do this job if you don't want. Even out of the Middle East, we'll send you somewhere else if you need a break from the Middle East. But at that point, to be quite honest, I was heartbroken. I don't know another way to say it. My belief in being able to change things from the inside sort of shattered at that point. And I'm not saying that that's not the case with other policies, right? The world is big. I have colleagues across the world. I think they're still making significant impact. But for me, it was clear that staying in was not going to affect change. And so I thought, I have no other choice but to resign and speak out. And I felt at that point an obligation to do so because there were so few voices able to talk about how this policy was actually violating US law, right? It's not just a matter of we care for the Palestinians, which of course we should, but it's also a matter of it's a violation of US law, it's a violation of international law, so on and so forth. It's a threat to US national security. So I felt a real sense of responsibility to speak out. And the only way I could do that was to resign. So I ended an 18-year career. I resigned, and the rest is history.
Just listening to that very detailed response, it sounds to me like you fell victim, if I can put it that way, to Washington's ideological commitments, its political commitments. At the same time, does institutionalized corruption play a role in the policy process? If it does, how does it manifest itself? What is it? How does it work?
Yes, absolutely. And this is a big realization that I had in my last few months in the State Department. So, as diplomats, our job is to inform policymakers. So I was a political officer most of my career, not in my last assignment, but most of my career I was a political officer, which meant that I wrote cables, right? And so the cables that we wrote and generated based on our expertise out in the field were sent to Washington, and they would help in policymaking, in formulating
Basically,
policy.
informing the policymakers in Washington what's
Exactly.
happening on the ground.
Exactly. Exactly. And I always felt, even if I wasn't able to shift a particular policy one way or another, I always felt like my reporting was critical and important. And if I had not been there, things could have possibly been even worse. So I always felt like things were progressing, even if it was like this, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But with this particular policy,
your point of view, your perspective, your reporting was taken into account one way or the other.
Exactly. Even if it wasn't able to shift policy,
Yeah.
I never, ever faced silencing throughout my 18 years. I never was told, okay, we don't want to see this, or you can't put that. It was never, ever the case until this particular policy. Mm-hmm. But what made it also very, very striking is that us out in the field were explaining how much this particular policy was a threat to US national security. It was actually hurting the United States of America in so many ways, and we were detailed this analysis over and over again. And it wasn't just me, it was multiple diplomats. But then our politicians were making absolutely contradictory decisions. And then we all realized that the politicians weren't taking anything that we were saying into consideration. The politicians that are deciding whether or not to send more arms to Israel know that we're in violation of Leahy law. They know that we're in violation of the Arms Export Control Act. They know that we're violating US law, but they have to answer to their donors. And for me, this was a huge aha moment. Perhaps it was naive that it came at this point, but before there was a sense of pretending, right? At least, but with this policy, there was no pretending. The veil was completely lifted. And even after my resignation, I walked the halls of Congress. I met with senators and Congress people, and I was detailing the violations of Leahy law, of Arms Export Control Act. And I was basically told, no, we know, but there's nothing we can do about it, because everybody is so scared that they're going to be voted out, like Congressman Jamal Bowman or Cory Bush. The power of, obviously, AIPAC.
That they would be primaried and expelled the way that these two were.
Exactly. And I'll state that there's been so much focus on AIPAC, which it deserves, but I want to have your audiences also look into the arms industry. Because when you have AIPAC and the arms industry working together, it is such a lethal combination that there's absolutely no incentive to change the policy. There's absolutely no incentive. There is so much profit in war, and our politicians are directly profiting from that war, from the genocide, to the point where they are knowingly and willfully violating US law. The level of institutionalized corruption at this point, for me, is a threat to not just our national security, but the fundamentals of our American democracy. Absolutely. But it's very easily spun in propaganda terms as we're protecting our ally, Israel, we're doing this. No, we're fundamentally going against US interests, US values, we're breaking US laws, because we actually have systems in place to ensure things like this don't happen. Again, I don't know how much detail you want to go into, but
please,
Labor law, Arms Export Control Act, all of these laws that are in place to make sure that US weapons are not used the way they're being used right now.
For the uninitiated, could you give just a very brief summary or description of these US laws?
Sure. So Leahy law, and your audience also can Google it. These are public. I'm not saying anything secret or anything. Leahy law is basically an American law that stipulates that no foreign military unit, no foreign military can receive U.S. military assistance if it has committed, at times potentially even there's suspicion that they've committed gross human rights violations. There is so much US government information confirming the Israeli military has committed gross human rights violations. So I worked in Qatar, where I had to apply Leahy law. We were so stringent, we were so meticulous about ensuring that Leahy law was not breached in any way. there is a willful violation of Leahy law. Secretary Blinken knew it. He lied to the American public. The Congress people that are voting to send more arms to Israel know that there's pure violation of Leahy law. They're violating the law. Arms Export Control Act is another law that basically stipulates US weapons can only be used for self-defense if we sell them or give them to another country. Why do you think Secretary Blinken kept on saying Israel has a right to defend itself? It wasn't just because it was a nice catchphrase. It was to be in line with the Arms Export Control Act, because we're not authorized to send weapons to a foreign country if they use it offensively. Then there's also the Foreign Assistance Act, which states that US government cannot provide military assistance to countries that block humanitarian assistance. I mean, you have Gazans starving to death. Obviously, Israel is blocking humanitarian assistance, yet the weapons flow continues.
And in
So for
this
me,
case, Israel
yes,
is publicly announcing that it's blocking it. Doesn't need any,
yeah,
examination.
exactly. So, I mean, the gross violations of US law, forget about international, but US law is so outrageous that there's no way around it. I think that's why the administration, both former and current, focus on things like, oh, it's anti-Semitism or it's pro-Hamas, all of this nonsense to be able to move people's attention away from the realities of the situation. And for me, fundamentally, and I say this not just as a diplomat, I say this as an American, the same reason why we keep having school shootings in American schools, because the NRA has bought practically every politician, is the same reason why there's an ongoing genocide in Gaza, because institutionalized corruption has taken over. It's no longer for the people, by the people. It's special interest, and how much influence do they have and can they yield? And that's extremely problematic, and it should be extremely problematic for every American, no matter what side of the aisle you're on or no matter what your political beliefs are.
But if I could just ask a follow-up question, aren't you being a little naive? I mean, one doesn't need to know much about the American political system to know that this is how it's supposed to work, that politicians are bought and paid for by special interests, by lobbies, whether domestic or foreign or what have you, and they vote accordingly. They they allow these funders to write the legislation that they introduce. Isn't that how what what American politicians call their democracy works? I mean, it's a financial system as much as it's a political system.
I mean, I think Citizens United, the ruling made that very much the case, but it's not supposed to be how our politics works. It is how our politics works now, and it has been how our politics has worked for a while, and especially with the advent of Citizens United, that basically allowed so much dark money
So this
to
was the
take
Supreme Court ruling, I think, in 2000 that allowed
the
unlimited,
exact. Yes, exactly. I have to look at the exact year, but yeah,
but it
around
allowed
that time.
unlimited corporate funding of political candidates.
Basically, for me, that was really a watershed moment. And I saw it even as a diplomat. The shift, the gradual shift of how much our word mattered and how less it mattered across the years. And I don't think we should accept that as citizens. Politicians are not supposed to answer to special interests. That's why, in answer to your first point, my response was, we're the ones who write the answer to that question, right? If that's the type of country we want to live in, where corruption is the politics of the day, and if that's what we accept and we continue to vote in Congress people that we know are bought and paid for, if we continue to take in and believe the propaganda that's fed to us by AIPAC or the arms industry or the NRA or whatever it is, and we keep voting for these corrupt politicians, then that's the system we're going to get. But it's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. And we don't have to accept that as our fate. And I hope we don't accept that, and we continue to insist that we should live in a better system that is actually representative of the people. Perhaps it is
Thanks.
naive, but I
No,
feel like that's what we should strive for.
I'm 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 gonna come back to that because it's important, and we have you here as someone who actually made a very bold decision. But I will come back to that and ask about the past and other people in your shoes as they go into government. So I want to address that dimension. It's very important, and as an educator who has a lot of students whose aspiration is actually to go into government since I don't know, since I started teaching in 1997, 98. It's been a very interesting topic, right? It's sensitive. It's also about livelihood. So it's not just about politics, especially like at a younger age and so on. But I want to ask about that, and I'm sorry that I'm like prefacing what I'm going to ask about later before I ask you this question. So apologies for that. I guess I'm not a professional podcaster. Thank God. All right.
You're doing
So
great.
thank you. So my question is regarding this institutional corruption that you've witnessed firsthand, and before getting to the idea of like this didn't just start with Gaza, but that's precisely the question. Beyond Gaza, beyond what is happening right now in Palestine, can you share with us in more detail how this question of institutionalized corruption in policymaking goes beyond the question of Palestine, and speaks to the erosion of our checks and balances to the extent that they exist, and also how that might affect the rules-based order, especially at this moment when it's being cast aside or just given no serious attention whatsoever. So how is this writ large beyond Gaza?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So to Mu'ayyan's point about sort of hasn't this always been the case? Yes, and to your point, Bassam, in terms of beyond Gaza, so empire has been there, right? Colonial empire, Europe, and then post-colonial, the United States. I mean, even if we look back to the 1950s of the U.S.'s role in Latin America and South America, and what Secretary of State Dulles did to Guatemala, overthrowing the democratically elected president because we wanted a stake in the United Fruit Company, right? So that level of corruption has always been there, and empire has always been there. But there's always been this layer of, especially from my perspective, in Western society, but there's a rules-based order, there's international law. Unfortunately for me, at this point, sort of the veil has been lifted on everything, and it almost seems like we've allowed it to be the pretext for exploitation, whether that's in the Congo or in Latin and South America, or broader Africa, or in Gaza as well. That are we allowing the rules-based order to actually protect people, or are we allowing the rules-based order to be helping the few, the West, and allowing the exploitation of others? Like the president of the Philippines was just arrested with the ICC, right? Out of all of the presidents in the world, but you have Netanyahu sitting where he is.
And
So,
getting over flights over
and
European countries
and
on his
giving
way to a
overflights. I
hero's
mean,
welcome in Washington.
exactly. I mean, the hypocrisy cannot be more blatant. So I think we are at a very critical point in terms of there's no more, for me, there's no more rules-based order at this point, unless there's accountability, unless there's really, really, really accountability, because the violations are so egregious, right? There's just so egregious. There's no one in their right mind, unless you're a Hasbara propagandist or you've completely succumbed to the propaganda and the dehumanization of Palestinians, can agree that Netanyahu is not a war criminal. And I think that the fact that I think the majority of the world is in agreement Again, they may not have the power, but at this point, I do think we've crossed that threshold where the majority of the world is in agreement. But if there's no justice there, if the impunity continues, it is, for me, the death of the rules-based order. But again, we are writing that. A couple days ago, there was the Madrid conference, where Spain hosted a lot of Arab foreign ministers, and other Europeans. Even Germany is now speaking out against Israel, still supporting. Again, this is again words versus action. The fact that Trump did not visit Israel and he visited Qatar instead. These are steps in the right direction. Unfortunately, Gazans are still starving. They're still being bombarded, right? It has not translated into tangible action. But back to my experience in South Africa, it does take gradual change. It does take gradual change. And I want to be hopeful, because if not, if we lose our hope, then what do we have, right? I want to be hopeful that these gradual steps will lead us in the right direction, and that Netanyahu will be behind bars, facing his own corruption trial in Israel, let alone for the genocide that he's perpetrated against the Palestinians, and that there's going to be a reckoning. There's going to be a reckoning in Israel itself, and on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and more broadly on sort of neo-colonial Western exploitation of lands, and theft of lands. But I do think we're at a time of global reckoning, and we'll just have to see where it takes us. But I am inspired by the youth. I think the youth have sort of woken up in ways that gives me hope as well.
You mentioned Hasbara, Israeli propaganda, and of course, an important tenet of Israeli propaganda is that Islamophobia doesn't really exist. It's a fraudulent invention, and that, yes, there is a fundamental problem of bigotry, and it's called anti-Semitism. Anti-Arab racism also is a concoction, also part of kind of an anti-Semitic plot or conspiracy. In your experience, is there Islamophobia? Is there anti-Arab racism in these central foreign policy institutions in the United States government? And if so, how are they manifested?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia. And I would go further to say there's absolute dehumanization of Arabs and of Muslims. There's this expectation almost that people there just get killed. People there just die. People there are always in wars.
It's the natural order of things.
They've always been fighting. They've always been, it's just how those people are. And to get to your point, Bassam, about students joining government, believe it or not, after my resignation, I did a tour at universities, including at Yale, and I was telling the students, who were very beautifully militant and anti, what was going on, I was telling them, join the US government, and they were so angry at me. How dare you tell us to join empire? But to this point, Mouin, if there is not representation in that room, people get away with it. There's no one to check them. There's nobody to say, that's wrong. You can't say that. You can't do that. And I feel like it's almost a natural order of people that are critical of the US government, rightly so, choose not to join. But then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It has to be so many of us that join. That is where the changes really, really happen, right? So if I'm the only one, there's strength in numbers. There is strength in numbers, right? And I can tell you I don't like to use the word sides, but if you want to talk about folks that are, I'll just say, pro-Israeli and intensely Zionist, there are plenty of them within the State Department and the broader U.S. interagency. And so their voices are heard. Their voices are heard loud and clear. And they propagate anti-Arab racism, and they propagate Islamophobia, and they propagate dehumanization. And unfortunately, many times it's left unchecked. And I would say it is because of the dehumanization that these policies are enabled, right? So for me, it's a pillar. There's the institutionalized corruption that really drives policy. And then what enables it is the dehumanization. Because if you don't see these people in Gaza as humans, then it's really okay if you're profiting off of their death, right? You don't feel for them the way you feel for the Ukrainians. And so when you combine those two things, you have the present situation. But obviously, and this has been decades in the making, right? This is 9/11, war on terror, and all of that. But again, even more of a reason for all of us to speak out.
Well, I'd like to follow up with a more detailed question. As I'm sure you're aware, there's been a lot of reporting in recent months confirming what several people were saying already years ago. Basically, Biden has lost his marbles, and he lost them some time ago. But if you look at his period in office, the one issue on which he seemed to have full cognitive control and never suffered a lapse, even for a micro millisecond, was his absolute passionate attachment and devotion to Israel. The same, I think, can be said for other senior members of this cast of characters: Blinken, Sullivan, McGurk. To what extent do you think anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia also figured into the life and death decisions they were making for hundreds of thousands of not only Palestinians in Gaza, but indeed Palestinians everywhere, Lebanese, Yemenis, Syrians, and so on?
I think it figured intensely. And I don't think, I know. I know it figured intensely. And I know exactly how it figured because I could see how my colleagues, for example, reacted to my reports. And when I would show them the images of the emaciated children, of the babies that were skin and bones, or of the toddler that was pulled out of rubble, the reactions on their faces at an emotional level were so distant that it was frightening to me.
Who cares?
I mean, I could tell you that I would go into the office and I'm being very honest, I would be in tears. I would be in tears because I humanly could not consume this content without getting emotional.
Mm-hmm.
But I did not see that level of emotion in colleagues that I once respected, and some of them I even admired. And I quickly realized that the dehumanization was not conscious. It was at the subconscious level, that they had been so drilled,
Programmed.
Programmed. And it's funny, just as a side note, I spoke to a veteran who told me that she used to have target practice to someone that looked stereotypically Arab, right? So it's programmed on so many levels. Whereas when we used to talk about Ukraine, the emotion would come out of them. And I could
Let alone October 7th.
Or on October 7th. Or when you saw Kirby, at the NSC, he was crying about Ukraine. Yeah. He was crying about October 7th, but never once did he show genuine emotion for
well, sorry to interrupt you, but I used to call Kirby Mr. Tears Toster because on the one hand, on October, when he was talking about Palestinians being slaughtered, he was like, yeah, war is hell, civilians get killed, get used to it.
Yeah, exactly.
But then when he was talking about October 7th, he had a breakdown and started crying hysterically like a baby.
Exactly.
And I think this is very much the point you're making.
Absolutely. They saw themselves in the Israelis. They saw them as humans, I think Secretary Blinken in particular had a very emotional family connection to Israel, where he felt ideologically that it was his responsibility to do anything and everything that he could for the state of Israel. And that ideology has been so ingrained, I think, in a certain political class in the United States, that no matter what, so it's the ideology of being pro-Israel and really, really believing in the establishment of the state of Israel at all costs, no matter what, that you must protect and defend the state of Israel, no matter what. And then secondly, coupled with anti-Arab racism, Palestinian racism,
They're the
dehumanizing
enemy, and because they're
Muslims.
Israel's enemy, they're
They
our
are,
enemy.
they are a threat. They are not like us. They've always been a threat to our civilization. They've always been killing each other. I mean, that's something that I heard all the time. They always kill each other. The Sunnis and the Shia, they're always killing each other. I heard that a lot with Iraq as well. Well, they've always been just killing each other. I mean, the things I could I could share of the things I heard throughout my 18 years in the Foreign Service, right? But the critical thing is that for me, I began to realize it's at the subconscious level. And when it comes to diplomats, generally speaking, there are some conservative diplomats, but generally speaking, the people that join the State Department, they're worldly. They're the ones that travel countries far and wide, different continents.
More
They tend to be
cosmopolitan.
they tend to be more liberal minded, more quote unquote tolerant. But again, this is for me when the veil was lifted, because you claim to be liberal, yet you turn a blind eye to kids of a certain color being killed, right? And I think you can take that and bring it to American streets, how so many whites are silent on police killings of Black Americans, right? I think there's so much racism that our society has not come to terms with, and it's at such a subconscious programmed level that we really do need to have a whole separate reckoning of race relations and how we see others and how we determine whether someone is worth human life or they're simply not.
If I could just follow up on that, and getting back to an earlier part of the discussion, you talked about earlier institutionalized corruption, but also specifically of American officials and politicians knowingly and willfully violating not just international law, but from their perspective, something even more serious, U.S. domestic law and legislation. And there had been persistent reports that Blinken was signing off on, for example, arms deliveries, that he not only had been informed, but that he had himself concluded were violating U.S. law and legislation. And there was this well-known incident where, at one point, he suggested that the U.S. would sanction a particularly extreme military unit, and then withdrew that.
Yes.
Could you just briefly explain on what basis you and others were able to conclude that Blinken, because you worked in the State Department and he was a Secretary of State, that that there's no doubt in your mind that he knew he was violating U.S. domestic legislation, U.S. law, and deliberately went ahead and violated it anyway?
So he had an exit interview after his last days, and he said, yes, I received all of the information, but as Secretary of State, it is my prerogative to gather all that information and then make the decision. That's how he sold it to the American public. That is an absolute lie. His role as Secretary of State, yes, is to gather the information and then, based on the law, apply the law. He doesn't get the information that says this unit committed gross human rights violations, but I'm determining as Secretary of State that even though this Army unit committed gross human rights violations, which our own US intelligence and our own US experts have confirmed, I'm going to just bypass that information anyways and just send them weapons. That is not how the law is written. Your audience can Google it, and we're talking about Leahy law again. So another State Department official, Stacy Gilbert, who's a civil servant, resigned because of that, because there was a separate report called the National Security Memorandum, where they wrote not recommendations, they wrote fact-finding information on how Israel was blocking humanitarian assistance. Therefore, again, based on another law, Foreign Assistance Act, Israel was no longer qualified to receive weapons. And again, once they got to Secretary Blinken and at the political level, they changed the facts. They changed the facts in order to keep sending weapons. Another thing that I'll tell you is willful. And even members of Congress realize this. There is a certain level where you have to get congressional oversight for weapons. So the State Department under Blinken would do it right below that level, just to not trigger the oversight. So when I tell you it's willful violation of the law, they knew exactly what they were doing, but they were getting away with it. And this is a big point. The reason why they were getting away with it, because the legislative branch, the ones that are supposed to do the checks and balances, they're all bought too. So we are today in the Trump era, and there are so many liberals that are saying, oh my goodness, look at what Trump is doing. Look what is happening. But I find it intensely ironic that those same liberals were completely quiet when the Biden administration was violating every law in the book practically with regard to this conflict. So we did not get here where we are today with Trump doing all the crazy things that he's doing overnight. No, we got here very, very slowly, and it started as well with the Democrats. And the reason why the Democratic Party is not able to stop him is because they're also bought and paid for by the same special interests. They are guilty of the same corruption that he is being accused of. So that checks and balances has been completely eroded. And again, I go back to, if you're an American, if you live in the United States, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, no matter whether you care about Palestine or not, this should be concerning to you and you should do something about it.
Hala, I want to return to the other questions that have to do with your work at the State Department and prospective quote unquote applicants and people who aspire to do that. But first, let me play this clip from 60 Minutes. It's one clip actually which got almost 4 million views, which speaks to the importance of this event, your resignation, and why and how it was. And I've followed your journey at that point, and how the level of interest was so magnified. And during the interview, you were as usual quite eloquent. So I'm going to play this. This might be audio for at this moment, but we'll try to get the video in. So we'll play that clip, and then if you can tell us a little bit about it and other parts of the interview, which we might actually end up, playing. One moment.
What is happening in Gaza would not be able to happen without U.S. arms. That's without a doubt.
Hala Rharrit was an American diplomat who spent nearly 2 decades posted in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where she worked on human rights and counterterrorism. She was stationed in Dubai on October 7th, where part of her job was to monitor Arab press and social media to document how America's role in the war was perceived in the Middle East. We've obtained daily reports Rharrit sent to senior leadership in Washington containing gruesome images and her warnings.
I would show the complicity that was indisputable. Fragments of U.S. bombs next to massacres of mostly children, and that's the devastation. It's been overwhelmingly children.
When you tried to speak out, vocalize what
Yes.
you saw happening in Gaza, you
Yes.
feel like you were told to shut up.
Yes. I would show images of children that were starved to death. In one incident, I was basically berated, don't put that image in there. We don't want to see it. We don't want to see that the children are starving to death.
Who told you that?
A colleague.
A superior?
Yeah. I was told the contrary by others. Keep them in. We need to see it.
3 months into the war, Rharrit says she was told her reports were no longer needed. She resigned last April.
This is just a sliver of the interview, but it's actually quite telling. This is basically the story that you have. You spoke out and you were asked to either not speak out or, in effect, you were silenced. Do you want to say a little bit more about this, or about the interview in general, and how you and whether you felt it kind of reflected sort of where you stood, and how it was received perhaps by your former colleagues?
Yeah, sure. Well, I can tell you that this is a little behind the scenes information. 60 Minutes interviewed me for an hour and a half and took literally minutes from that hour and a half. So there was a lot of content. And then they tried to, and I think they did actually a really great job to try to deliver a message to the American public that really focused on American complicity, and that's what they wanted Americans to really understand. And this was the first time, I would say, that such blatant messaging got across on mainstream media. The reaction was intense, I can tell you. I appeared on a lot of media before 60 Minutes. I appeared, on CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post. I did a lot of media before 60 Minutes, but this one, I think because it's such a respected program, perhaps, and it really goes into people's living rooms, and perhaps it was the one that was seen as the most of a threat to Hasbara. I got an intense level of hate and threats, and it's all online, so for me, it's not really real. If you get threats online, for me, it's very easy to just dismiss. But I can say that it really, really amped up with 60 Minutes. I can tell you my former colleagues, to answer your question. I think, look, a lot of former colleagues, I think, are, some of them are heartbroken, and they know, but they feel like for whatever reason they can't quit or they can't resign. I can say, I spent 18 years in the State Department. It was a very, very long time. And it's not just a job. It's your whole life, right? It's your kids' education. Where I lived, I had to move when I resigned. I had to find housing for my family and I. Even your license plate on your car has to be changed from a diplomatic, obviously you have a diplomatic passport. It's so much that is in your sphere. But for me, one of the hardest parts was seeing colleagues be willfully silent.
Fear?
For whatever. Yeah, fear. Some is fear, and and then I also saw sort of much uglier parts of human beings, where it's career progression, and
Opportunism.
Opportunism, and I saw a lot more of that than I had anticipated. And I say had anticipated because people don't. Diplomacy is not like the private sector, right? You don't join because you want to make a bunch of money. You supposedly join because you want to try to do good in the world. However you see that good in the world, you're supposed to, right? And so seeing that pure careerism and people trying to get promoted out of atrocities and out of a genocide was really, really disgusting. And also others that are just fearful and silent. But then I think at the very fundamental level, more so than any other points in my career, truly understood how atrocities keep happening over and over and over again throughout human history, how the Holocaust happened, how slavery happened for so many years at such a grand scale. It's when people know that something is wrong, yet they choose to stay silent. And when that's the majority of people, you keep having atrocities. You keep having never agains happen again and again and again, because people
it's not
choose
just staying silent, it's keeping the system moving.
And I think people do it I don't think, I know people do it for self-preservation. I would have colleagues tell me, look, I have a mortgage to pay. Or look, I have, I have tuition to pay. Guess what? I have those things too, right? And so I think people do it as a means of self-preservation, but they don't realize that it's going to come back to hurt them. They think, well, as long as I keep my head down, I'll be okay. No, you're actually creating the system that is going to collapse everything, right? I mean, it's the irony of Samantha Powers staying quiet, the USAID director who wrote a book on
Problem
genocide.
criminal. Yeah.
The irony of her willfully staying silent when she knew it was a genocide. She wrote a textbook on genocide, and then as soon as she leaves, USAID gets destroyed. All of those USAID officials that knew but stayed silent, right? And the diplomats that now also are fearing for their jobs. You are feeding the beast, and you think by staying silent and saving yourself at the cost of others that you're going to be safe, but in reality, you're not safe. You're actually endangering everybody else. And that's the message that I want to get to people. You think by just staying quiet, you're just going to make things okay. It's quite the opposite. You're endangering the reality that we all live in if you're willfully okay with other people being killed, exploited, and hurt.
This is precisely the moment, I guess. I want to introduce what I was thinking about asking, and that is, and bear with me. It's a little, it's a little tedious. So, and it really follows from what you said. So, working with government is a decision, right? It's a decision, and those of us who teach at university, and I taught at AU and then Georgetown, and then now I've been teaching at George Mason for 18 years. And a lot of people go through these programs, undergrad, masters, and PhD, and they have an interest in working in government. And I want to ask the question with reference not to the people who are gung-ho about working with government because they believe we're doing, or the US is doing, a good thing. And of course, there are mistakes and imperfections, but generally, they have no illusions about, or they don't have a critical perspective that this is an actual empire, and so on and so forth. So I'm not talking about this group of people. I'm referring to the people who have that consideration, who understand precisely what the U.S. is and does and has been doing for decades, and so on. Yeah. So when folks are not naive about the U.S. empire, the decision is made based on, there are two options that I'm gonna give, and of course there are others, but two broad ones. One, the idea that one can actually change or affect policy somehow, to whatever extent, and then B, that you can't really affect policy beyond momentary or marginal matters, but that in the absence of critical voices, the counterfactual that is, things would be much worse. Strengthen numbers, as you suggested, something that you could do to hold off, quote unquote, the other side, so to speak. So in other words, working with government to reduce its harm, knowing full well that this is the ceiling of impact, is to actually make it a lesser evil, perhaps. I mean, potentially. I mean, there is this genre of folks. So if it's A, then folks who are genuine about change and perhaps naive about change would be disappointed, and then, of course, either stay or leave based on their life circumstances, because there is a, livelihood aspect to this. If it's B, the realist approach, in other words, folks know the limitations, but continue working because of also either livelihood necessities, because it's a job, or I guess because the expectations were low to begin with, so there's nothing that would compel them to leave, right? So clearly there are other, variations and motivations in between for working with government. But where does your journey fall between a naive and a realist view, given that, then that you came in with you were aware what's going on, and then at the same
Yeah.
time you ended up leaving. Is it the
Yeah.
extent of the horror?
Well, a short answer to that, yes. Is it the extent of the horror? Yes. So I'll zoom out a little bit, and not talking strictly about the United States, but zooming out. Fundamentally, I'm a believer in diplomacy. Full stop. I fundamentally believe in the power of negotiation, in the power of looking out for, again, for lack of a better word, both sides, of trying to, through communication, find resolution to conflict at practically all costs. I believe violence begets more violence, violence begets more trauma, and that it's a vicious cycle. And if it's at all feasible or possible, the role of diplomacy is to be able to find solutions to conflicts in a way that saves lives. So from a pure, forget about what country I'm talking about, I'm a believer in diplomacy. So I wanted to be a diplomat based on how much I cherish the craft and the art of diplomacy. That's one. Two, I went in very, very clear-eyed about empire. And Bassam, you've known me for many, many years. When I was a student, I was protesting in front of the White House all the time for the Iraq invasion. I actually was doing a study abroad in Cairo, and we were trying to get to a protest to the U.S. embassy, but the Cairo riot police were beating us down. I never had any delusion regarding empire. But I also know that government is made of people, human beings. And I think especially in the Arab world, you have this image of this all-powerful government, this all-powerful American government that controls so much. And then you join government and you realize it's just regular people. It's just regular people making decisions that have compounded effect. And again, back to my point, it's when I'll give an example at Yale. When I spoke to the students at Yale, they told me, and these were all of the activist students that were doing the encampments and everything. They're like, there's always a particular type of Yale student that joins the Foreign Service. There's always a particular type that joins the government. And those are the ones, like you mentioned, that are gung-ho, that are not critical about US government, that the US can never do any wrong, right? And those are the people that manifest the policies that we have today. I still fundamentally believe, even though I resigned, I still fundamentally believe that we need to be the change that we want to see, right? But it does have to be a lot of us. I mean, imagine a reality where all of the students from the encampment join government. Imagine. And presumably, there's no reason, unless they were convicted and have sort of a record, presumably they would be able to. That is how generational change happens. That is how generational change happens. Again, I hear Mouin thinking, oh, she's so naive. I hear you saying it even though you're not saying it out loud.
I'm saying or thinking nothing of the sort.
And I think, and I'll speak as an Arab American, I think for us as the Arab American community, and I'll say this from my personal experience because I don't want to generalize. I had so many fellow students be like, how dare you join the government? What are you doing? You're what? But again, just think about Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Think about how much impact she's had as the only Palestinian American in Congress. If she wasn't there wouldn't even be that one voice. Is she making a difference? Could you say she's changing policy? No. But imagine what it would be like if she wasn't there, or Ilhan Omar. So are we going to willfully yield the space? Are we going to just give away the space and say, tfaddal, we're not even going to try? Or are we going to say, this is our America too. We are American, and we are going to insist on the America that we want based on US values, on US laws and everything. So obviously I resigned, so it's a bit ironic for me to say that, but to go back to there are many policies, right? And I've had actually a lot of current diplomats reach out to me that I don't even know, having that conflict within themselves. Should I stay? Should I leave? And my point is always, if you're not being silenced, if you still have a voice, if you still feel like you're being heard, if you can push the envelope a little bit more, if your representation in that room is not being completely sidelined, if you're making a difference, then stay. But in my situation, I was being silenced, I was being sidelined. And again, this policy was being very much run by the top, that I felt it was more important to speak out against it publicly. And when you're on the inside, you can't speak out publicly. Obviously, you have to keep your mouth shut. And I was no longer able to keep my mouth shut. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope that helps at least a little bit.
Yes, I mean, I actually, as I shared, I mean, my politics. I mean, you were protesting the Iraq war, as with all of us, and except that I was also protesting the previous one in 1991, not because I supported the takeover of Kuwait and the way it happened and so on, but we were protesting basically the actual long-term policy and motivations behind the actual war, as well as the manner this would play out in general. So, and I was also, we're kind of in the same boat, and I'm opposed to not just the U.S. government, but almost any government, except that the U.S. is the most powerful country in human history, and its effects have been, in my view, especially in the Middle East, extremely detrimental and beyond. So in my view, I'm a critical, author, scholar, academic, whatever. I don't like any of these labels. Author may be decent. So when I'm asked by students, would you be upset if I go into government? Especially, we're talking about 19 and 20-year-olds, and I always say no. You need to do what you want to do. I'll equip you to do what you want to do to the best of your ability and to the best of mine. Especially at that age. I mean, a lot of people go back and forth. I had students who wanted to change the world and who thought that I was too moderate because I did not call for certain things, which was funny because somebody called me, moderate, especially vis-a-vis questions of IMF, International Monetary Fund, and so on. And that student ended up working for the IMF 6 years later. So I've learned my lesson that at this stage, people should do what is good for them and what they can live with, and so on and so forth. So I'm not, I'm not going to advise anybody against or for, but to ask them to stay true to themselves. And this is precisely what, I'm assuming caused you to actually end up leaving. So I do appreciate, the difficulty. But I also wanted to ask you, as somebody who's been there for so many years, which is a question that also relates to the theme of the podcast or whatever it is. Mouin, what are we doing? Is this a podcast?
Let's figure that out later.
Yeah. Bad after the conversation. So what I wanted to ask you is the incentive structure that drove you, or that, sort of caused you to actually go work with government, then the same one today? I mean, are we in a situation where we actually need to do, quote unquote, to do this more? Or is it becoming maybe clear to some that this route is actually, is
A dead
hopeless
end.
or a dead end? Or is it because that it's a dead end, we should not leave it to the quote unquote, the monsters that, for instance, are supporting genocide, or who are indifferent to genocide? So are we in a moment where you would advise people to do what actually? I'm personally not sure.
Yeah. Look, I would say, first of all, the world is very big, right? And US policy, yes, there's US empire, and US empire is driven by interests and all of that, 100% fundamentally. Yet policy ranges drastically, whether you are working on, for example, US Venezuela relations versus US Chile relations versus US France relations versus US Qatar relations, right? So I obviously Gaza is the most egregious of all examples, but policy making and the influence on policy making can be broad depending on where you work. So for example, initially when I went to work in Yemen, I was one of the very few experts on Yemen, and I was considered a junior officer. I was very young. It was my first assignment. But because there were so few people that knew anything about Yemen and had expertise in that country, my expertise was listened to by very senior officials because there were so few people that actually knew anything about the country, and it was thrust into. Again, there was an Al Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula attack on the embassy, so there was all of this stuff that was happening. So I would say I don't want to make a blanket. It's a dead end, because really, it really depends. Number one, what are you passionate about? Where do you want to focus your career? On what region? On what issues? Is it climate change? Is it this? There's just so much that you could work on. Number one. Number two, again, back to my original point of, you have to go in clear-eyed, and you have to understand that this is a machine and this is a system, and it is US empire, and you have to be a good student of history. You have to understand what the CIA did in Latin America and South America, and the fact that we orchestrated all these coups for our own financial interest as the US empire. You have to be clear-eyed that, Bush, etc., lied about Iraq. You have to know what you're getting yourself into. And for me, it was because of all of that. Maybe I'm crazy, but for me, it was because of all of that. I want to go in, and I want to see how the hell things happen. I want to see how decisions are made. I want to see why decisions are made. I want to see, can I influence those decisions in any way, shape, or form, right? But that leads me to my third point, and you alluded to this, Bassam. You have to be true to yourself, and you have to be true to your values. And you can never, ever, for me at least, let your own red lines be crossed. And if you're going to be there, make it count. Make it count. Make it count that you're in the room. Don't just get in the room and then stay quiet. And this is what was so frustrating for me, is that I don't want to make this about minorities, but I will be blatant about it. A lot of times I would see minorities join the State Department, whether they were African American or Latin American or whatever it may be, and they held on to these passions early on when they were younger diplomats, but then very easily got co-opted for whatever reason, for a host of reasons, right? And so they'd be in the room, but it didn't matter anymore, because whatever was being said, they wouldn't share their point of view that was different from anybody else. So
Kept
I
their
would
heads
say,
down.
keep their heads down. Keep your head. So for me, what's the point? We have one life to live. We have one life to live, and I want to do as much with my one life that I possibly have, even if that's getting into a lot of trouble, if it's good trouble, right? So if you choose to go down that path, and for me, again, it would be amazing if people that were very, and I'm not saying critical of US government, but critical of US empire that's exploitative, that violates US laws, that violates international law, right? Those that are driven by sense of justice and peace, if those types of people joined US government and actually made their voices loud, that I think could be transformative. But unfortunately, I've seen some of those people join and then they quickly become co-opted by a multitude of reasons. So I would say, if you have students, give them that reminder. Just don't forget why you joined. Don't forget what you believe in, and make your presence count. Make your voice heard.
I've a related question, which is that you're not the only official who has resigned from the U.S. government. A number of others, small in number, but a number of others have also resigned in protest, specifically about U.S. Support for the Gaza genocide. They are from different departments, but have you set up any kind of network that brings you together, that
Yeah.
allows you to advocate in public as a group, or are you all working individually?
Oh no, we're like a family. We talk to each other all the time. I mean, I didn't know any of them before my resignation. Josh Paul was the first State Department official to resign. He was not a diplomat; he was a civil servant,
Mhm.
and he sort of became, like our guardian or our father. And our group has grown. We really represent the interagency between Department of Defense, Department of Interior, Department of Education, and we really are like a family. We talk on a regular basis, and we try to support each other's work and initiatives. Josh was also with me on that 60 Minutes episode that you showed, Bassam, and they're all doing impactful work, and they're still all advocating for Palestine. So absolutely, you sort of, it's funny, you find your kindred spirits through this whole insane process that we've all been living through over the last year and a half. But absolutely, I'm in touch with them.
Our last question is also about genocide, but this time the much more serious, long-term, horrific genocide being perpetrated by the South African government against the oppressed Afrikaners of South Africa. Um, in your view, why why is the Trump administration finally recognizing that this genocide has been taking place for so very, very long while the world is silent and looks the other way and tries to focus on Gaza? Um, what do you think is behind this? And how is it related to Gaza? There are some suggestions that this is payback for South Africa having the temerity to go to the International Court of Justice and invoke the Genocide Convention against Israel. What are your thoughts on this?
And let me just interject a bit. And I know we talked about this, you and I, Hala, and
Mhm.
I know you have a lot to say, and you've done quite a bit of work. And of course, it's important to recognize that your work at the State Department also included, a lot of other cases. So in this last question, we would love for you to, address the South Africa for sure, but also feel free to address other matters if you wish.
So I'm so glad that you've asked about South Africa, because for me it is absolutely related. And I served in South Africa, so it has a special place in my heart in particular. But absolutely, without a doubt, this is punishment for South Africa bringing the case against Israel at the ICJ. It's the Trump
Sorry to
administration.
interrupt, but it's more than just another uh, pet project of Elon Musk.
Oh, without a doubt, Elon Musk was involved in this. But under the first Trump administration, uh, I was in South Africa, and as he was coming in, I was almost leaving, and he appointed a U.S. ambassador, and they were bringing those issues up then as well. So this was pre-Elon Musk, and they were bringing up. They didn't go as far as calling it a white genocide, but they were concerned about the killing of white farmers, and they were asking the embassy to look into it more. So it didn't just start with Elon Musk. I think it comes from fundamentally a white supremacist policy of caring about white lives more than black lives. And Elon Musk put it on steroids, and really he is personally impacted by it. And his family is very much a pro-apartheid family, and they're very known in South Africa for who they are and who they were. That without a doubt, this is him influencing Trump. But I think in addition to that, without a doubt, it's those influencing Trump trying to put South Africa back in their place, quote unquote, for them having the audacity of bringing Israel to the ICJ and ensuring that if you accuse us of genocide, we will accuse you of genocide. This is, look, I don't have
Us
proof for this.
being the United States feeling it has itself been accused because Israel is accused.
Look, I'll tell you this, Mouin. There were some times that I, as a spokesperson, I would get asked, where did you get this line? This isn't from us. We wouldn't write that, as in we US officials. And I was told we got it from the Israelis. So the Israeli government and Hasbara, they're very, very good at providing, and I'm no longer on the inside, unfortunately, so I don't have proof for this, but I know from my past experiences from being on the inside, they're very good at having a finished product and saying, there you go ahead and use this. And so I very much can see a situation where some part of the Israeli government said, okay, this is a perfect way to punish and silence South Africa. There you go, Trump administration, roll it out. Now, how dare you accuse us? We will accuse you. For me, it's very, very clear in my mind. But for your audiences that may not be as familiar with South Africa, I served in South Africa for over 2 years. I worked on political violence in particular. And as everybody knows, South Africa there's a lot of crime in South Africa. It has a very difficult history, apartheid, pre-apartheid, apartheid, and then post-apartheid. But fundamentally, there is still economic apartheid in South Africa. So a bit of context, which I personally wish that President Ramaphosa had said this history in front of Trump at the Oval Office. And I'm very frustrated that he was so diplomatic that he chose not to educate Trump right then and there and put him in his place. But in 1913, the apartheid government signed a law called the Natives Land Act, which basically relegated Black South Africans to 1/10 of all the territory of all of South Africa, a tiny piece of land. They were not allowed to own or rent land on what was initially 7%, and then it grew to 13% of all land of South Africa. So imagine that. They were forced off of the land. Again, so many similarities with Palestine. They were forced off of the land and were only allowed to be in particular areas, tiny townships, 13% of the land. That means that the whites had all of the arable land, had all the farmable land. Those systems have stayed in place. So when I went to South Africa, I was very surprised to actually see how so many South Africans are critical of Nelson Mandela. Because, for me as an American, Nelson Mandela was always a hero. But there was a lot of criticism that although South Africa had liberated itself politically from apartheid, it never liberated itself economically from apartheid. So whites continued to own all the land. They continued to be the owners of the businesses, of the land, and Blacks were relegated to be workers. That's it. And forget about the Bantu education, which is a whole other conversation. I mean, we could have a whole show just about South Africa. But this whole land expropriation without compensation issue that came up in government was basically saying we have to take back the land that was stolen from Blacks and distribute it in a more equitable fashion. That's one thing that Trump was claiming. There's a genocide. You're taking their land. You're stripping them from their livelihood and all that. Whites to this day, the vast majority of them are still extremely wealthy compared to Black South Africans. I mean, it's absurd. Secondly, actual farm murders. The murder rate in South Africa, generally speaking, is very high. But I particularly worked on political violence, where you have mayors killing other mayors, you have city councilors shooting down city councilors. Unfortunately, with the lack of economic justice has come a lot of violence, not just on whites, but on even politicians, and on obviously just regular people. And proportionally, Blacks are the ones that are getting killed a lot more than whites. So obviously, it's an absolute disgrace to the notion of genocide that the Trump administration has said that there's a genocide against white people. It's indicative of a white supremacist ideology. And for me, it's absolutely tied to Israel, because they're just punishing South Africa for daring to take Israel to the ICJ. That was a lot of information.
No, I actually
Very
have a
useful
lot of
information at
questions,
that.
and we've kept you for too long. Mouin and I have nothing else to do in our lives, so we can be here until a few more days if you like. But I wanted to see if Mouin had the follow up before I move on.
No, I'm just, it's also gives the opportunity to bring numbers of new white supremacists to the United States. That's maybe the
Exactly.
other side.
More Trump voters.
Yes. But no, it's really been a fascinating conversation, Hala. Extremely rich and in detail and information and analysis, and we're very grateful for you making the time to speak with us.
No, it's my absolute pleasure.
Definitely. And I don't know if the recent there's a little tiff between Trump and Musk. But
Yeah, I saw that.
every time we hear about rifts between Biden and Netanyahu, and Trump and Netanyahu, and Musk and Trump, I mean, are they really rifts? Okay, so I think actually this one is more real because this guy is getting out, and he's thinking about other things. Because BYD is taking over the electric car industry, and he's really pissed off. BYD,
Well,
the
we'll
Chinese
know the
electric
rift is
vehicle.
real when he starts losing the government contracts that have made him what he is.
Yeah.
So we will see. Hala, this has been really insightful. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing really candidly your experience, and for let's be honest, you were in a difficult position, and when you got out, you were very open about it, and I think a lot of your journey is a really good blueprint for a lot of people to take note of as they ponder, the kinds of questions we addressed, notably questions of working with government. Although I am not sure if or to what extent working with different types of institutions within government is an issue, but it's still a nice. I don't think nice is the right word, but it's still an important narrative for those considering a similar path. And there are also, in my view, especially today, especially given the kind of polarization that's taking place, not just between Republicans and Democrats, but I think it's just a much wider polarization, that there are other ways to affect change, perhaps within government, but notably outside government these days, especially these days, and in this era, which is not something that in my view, is likely to change considerably and return back to the way things are. I think we're in a different moment, neither good or bad yet, but we're in a different moment, different potential. So I hope that you can, fulfill whatever you have aimed to fulfill now that you're outside government. And I hope that you join us again. Maybe we can have a conversation with a number of folks that had similar experiences to talk about your comparative experiences. I've talked about this with you before, so perhaps we can do that. Shukran for your time and your generosity.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you to you both. It was a really pleasure to be with you guys.
Quite a discussion.
Absolutely. It's one thing to watch the news about these folks leaving office. It's another to have an extended conversation. It was really eye-opening, and it's not easy, as I was saying. It's not easy to join for someone who is aware of the structural shortcomings, not just policy shortcomings, but then, of course, to make
And
the
once you're in,
decisions
it's
and to
difficult to
talk
get
about
out.
it.
And once you're in, it's difficult to get out.
Yeah, especially that it's actually also a job.
Yeah.
A lot of people discount the idea that, when you're, your 20s, I mean, you're looking to make a living. Not that this should determine everything, but it is a factor. Wow. Okay. So we continue. We continue to plow ahead. Hopefully we could speak with I know that we spoke about Josh Paul. I forgot to ask the question regarding his contribution to a major report on export control, which Noura was involved in, arms exports, and the legality and illegality of it. But we might get to that. We may
Yeah, and I
speak
like
ahead.
this idea you suggested of speaking with several of these.
Yeah, and we are in
resigned
touch with them. We have,
individuals.
so we'll see.
Great.
Anything else, Maureen, you want to say? This
No, I
was
think
early for us.
we've
We
said
never
so
do
much in
early
the past 2
interviews.
hours. So
We're speaking on top of each other, which is great because we're probably both not listening.
now we're
See you
both
soon.
silent.
We have the same judgment regarding pauses, so we speak at the same time. طيب. نشوفك.
Inshallah. Thanks, Habibi.
هلا هلا.
Bye.